Dear listeners, tonight we bring you a tale of intrigue and deception, one that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last second. A case so perplexing, so entangled in mystery, that even the great Hercule Poirot himself had to rely on his finest deductive skills to unravel it. The Shadows at Blackwood Manor, a chilling tale of betrayal, lost secrets, and an unsolved murder that haunts the corridors of an ancient estate. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another thrilling detective story. Now settle in and let the mystery unfold. It was a cold evening in late autumn, the kind that carries an air of foreboding. The towering Blackwood Manor loomed against the crimson-streaked sky, its age-old stone walls whispering of secrets long buried. The grand masquerade was in full swing, glimmering chandeliers cast golden light over masked guests, laughter echoed through the halls, and the orchestra played a waltz that seemed to dance on the very edge of unease. But beneath the facade of revelry, something sinister stirred. At precisely midnight, a scream shattered the night, a cry so chilling that it silenced the music in an instant. The guests turned toward the grand staircase, where Lady Evelyn Blackwood, the esteemed hostess, stood trembling. Her gaze was fixed upon the lifeless figure sprawled across the marble floor below. The mask had slipped from the victim's face, revealing the unmistakable features of Lord Edgar Fairfax, one of the wealthiest men in London, now nothing more than a motionless shadow against the cold stone. By sheer fate, Hercule Poirot and I found ourselves among the guests that evening, drawn to Blackwood Manor by an invitation that had arrived in the most peculiar manner, a sealed envelope with no return address, marked only with a single cryptic phrase, "Beware the man without a face." It was a challenge that Poirot could not ignore. As the guests murmured in hushed horror, Poirot remained unshaken. His sharp, calculating eyes swept the room, absorbing every detail. "Mon ami," he said, turning to me with quiet intensity, "do you not see? The answer is here, hidden among these masks, among the whispers of the past." The more we delved into the lives of those present that evening, the more entangled the mystery became. Lord Fairfax, it seemed, had many enemies, business rivals, scorned lovers, and those who sought revenge for wrongs long forgotten. But what of the warning in the letter? Who was the man without a face? And more importantly, was this the only crime committed that night? Just as we began to piece together the puzzle, another shocking revelation sent the room into chaos. The infamous opera singer, Vivienne Moreau, who had been engaged in hushed conversation with Fairfax only hours earlier, was found unconscious in her dressing chamber, an empty vial of laudanum beside her. Attempted suicide, or a desperate attempt to silence a secret too dangerous to be spoken. The case that began as a simple murder had now spiraled into something far more complex, more sinister, a web of deceit, hidden identities, and a truth so dark that it threatened to shatter the very foundation of those who walked the hallowed halls of Blackwood Manor. And yet in that moment, Poirot merely straightened his perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured, a knowing glint in his eye, "the game is afoot, and the truth is far closer than it appears." Little did we know, the real horror was yet to come. Poirot, to my mild frustration, seemed utterly uninterested in the morning's most perplexing case. Instead, he sat before the mirror, his eyes fixed intently upon his own reflection, as he delicately twirled the ends of his mustache. "Mon ami," he murmured, inspecting the gleam of his new pomade, "this truly is a marvel, a masterpiece for the mustache." I sighed, shaking my head at his vanity. However, upon catching my expression, he straightened slightly, and added with affected interest, "But of course, Hastings, you were saying, what do you make of this case?" Before I could answer, the door swung open, and our landlady announced a familiar visitor. Inspector Gabriel Reed of Scotland Yard strode in, his usual confident demeanor giving way to something graver. Poirot and I exchanged glances before greeting him warmly. "Ah, Reed," Poirot said smoothly, rising to shake his hand, "and what pressing matter has drawn you to our humble abode so early?" Reed lowered himself into the chair opposite us, rubbing a gloved hand over his stubbled jaw. "I have a case," he began, eyeing Poirot keenly, "one that I believe is precisely your sort of thing." His voice carried an unusual note of urgency. "Frankly, I could use your insight." Poirot raised an amused brow, his fingers steepling. "Ah, so I am to assist you, or as is often the case, you seek my wisdom while allowing Scotland Yard to bask in the triumph." I suppressed a smirk. Reed, unbothered, continued. "It's the Masquerade tragedy," he said gravely. "I assume you've read about it." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "I have skimmed the sensational headlines, but one cannot always trust the flair of a journalist. Enlighten me with the facts." Reed exhaled and began. 2 nights ago, the elite of London society gathered at the Ravenwood Grand Ballroom for the most exclusive event of the season, a lavish masquerade hosted by the enigmatic Lady Isabella Montclair. The guest list was as prestigious as it was secretive, for the invitations were personalized and delivered by hand. No uninvited guests, no chance encounters. He leaned forward, yet, in the midst of the festivities, beneath the glittering chandeliers and the shimmering masks, a tragedy unfolded. At precisely midnight, the lights flickered, just for a second. When they stabilized, Lord Alistair Wyndham, heir to the Wyndham fortune, was found collapsed near the orchestra pit, a single crimson stain blooming across the white silk of his costume. Dead before he hit the ground. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Poirot, however, remained perfectly composed, his grey eyes gleaming with interest. "And the cause?" "An ornate dagger," Reed said, pulling a photograph from his pocket and placing it on the table. Poirot leaned in, studying the image, an antique piece belonging to Lady Montclair's collection. It had been on display, locked in a glass cabinet. Reed's tone darkened, yet when we examined it, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks. It was as if the dagger simply removed itself, found its way into a hand unseen, and struck with deadly precision. A silence fell over the room. The air felt thick with the weight of unanswered questions. "And the suspects?" Poirot asked finally, his voice a mere whisper. Reed sighed. "Every guest at that masquerade is a suspect, each one concealed behind a mask, their identities blurred by costumes and deception. We have a ballroom full of alibis, each one more elaborate than the last, and yet someone in that room orchestrated a murder in plain sight." Poirot leaned back, his fingers once again twirling the tip of his mustache, this time in thought rather than vanity. "Fascinating," he mused. "A room full of masks, a weapon that moves unseen, and a victim who never saw the blade coming." He glanced at me, his lips curling ever so slightly. "Tell me, Hastings, do you not feel the irresistible pull of a puzzle most intricate?" I swallowed hard, nodding. "Indeed," I murmured, "but the question remains, who among them was bold enough to kill in the middle of a crowded ballroom, and clever enough to vanish into the masquerade?" Little did we know, the most chilling revelation was yet to come. There were whispers in the air, some hushed, others scandalously loud, about the impending engagement of Lord Sebastian Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore estate, and the dazzling yet enigmatic actress Vivienne Sinclair. She was the reigning star of the Belgrave Theatre, known among her admirers simply as Vivi, a woman of striking beauty, possessing both charm and a fiery temperament. She was a fixture in high society's most exclusive circles. The night of the Ravenwood Masquerade Ball was meant to be a grand affair, a spectacle where London's elite mingled under the guise of intricate costumes and elaborate masks. The Whitmore party, consisting of 6 notable figures, arrived in a striking ensemble inspired by the Venetian Carnival, each of them a living embodiment of the characters from the fabled Commedia dell'arte. Lord Whitmore, tall and imposing, played the role of Harlequin, his intricate diamond-patterned suit a stark contrast to the somber expression beneath his mask. His cousin, the ever-cynical Julian Ashford, took on the persona of the brooding Punchinello, while the charismatic American widow, Evelyn Montrose, accompanied him as Pulcinella. Renowned playwright Elias Harrow and his wife Celeste embodied Pierrot and Pierrette, their presence adding a touch of theatrical elegance, and at the center of them all, Vivienne Sinclair, breathtaking in her Columbine costume, the delicate gold embroidery glistening under the grand chandeliers. But despite the brilliance of the evening, tension crackled beneath the surface. It was clear to those who observed them closely, something was deeply wrong between Lord Whitmore and Vivienne. The charming playfulness they were known for had vanished. Throughout the night, Whitmore remained distant, his gaze dark and unreadable. Vivienne, usually the embodiment of confidence, had been seen wiping away silent tears, her usual grace replaced by a nervous energy. By the time the clock struck 11, the air between them had thickened into something almost unbearable. The breaking point came at supper, in a private dining hall reserved exclusively for their group. The tension reached its peak. The conversations were forced, laughter hollow. Lord Whitmore, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass, exchanged no more than a few clipped words with Vivienne. She, in turn, barely touched her food, her face pale beneath her mask. Then, as if unable to endure another moment of the charade, she abruptly rose from the table, her voice sharp as she turned to Elias Harrow. "Take me home, Elias," she demanded, her words cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "I've had enough of this wretched masquerade." The playwright hesitated, casting an uncertain glance at Lord Whitmore. The tension in the room was suffocating. Whitmore said nothing, merely watching Vivienne with an expression unreadable, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the table. Then, in an almost imperceptible movement, he inclined his head, whether in dismissal or resignation, no one could tell. Elias finally nodded and reached for Vivienne's arm, guiding her toward the door. But before they could step out into the dimly lit corridor beyond, something inexplicable happened. The room plunged into darkness, a sharp intake of breath, then silence. And when the lights flickered back on, Lord Sebastian Whitmore lay slumped over the table, his mask askew, a single scarlet stain blooming against his pristine costume. The masquerade had turned to murder. Despite all attempts to reconcile them, the rift between Lord Sebastian Whitmore and Vivienne Sinclair only deepened as the night wore on. Their last conversation had been sharp, her words laced with fury, his silence as cold as ice. When the tension finally snapped, Vivienne had stormed out of the Ravenwood masquerade, tears streaking down her painted cheeks, her glittering columbine mask dangling from her fingers. The only one to accompany her was Elias Harrow, the playwright, who hastily called for a taxi, promising to see her safely home. During the ride, she remained tight-lipped, her rage simmering beneath a veneer of fragility. "He'll regret this," she muttered once, her voice trembling. "I swear he will." But she refused to elaborate, shaking her head whenever Elias pressed for answers. By the time they arrived at her elegant townhouse in Belgravia, she had withdrawn into an eerie calm, dismissing Elias at the door with a ghost of a smile. "Go back," she told him. "Enjoy the rest of the ball." He hesitated, but seeing that her earlier hysteria had subsided, he finally obeyed. That was the last time she was seen alive. Meanwhile, back at the masquerade, the atmosphere had shifted. Lord Whitmore, usually the life of any gathering, had grown increasingly reclusive as the night progressed. He drifted away from his group, seen only in glimpses, standing alone on the shadowed balcony, lost in thought in the dimly lit corridors. Shortly after midnight, Captain Jonathan Digby, a fellow officer who recognized his elaborate harlequin costume, spotted him lingering in one of the upper boxes, overlooking the grand ballroom. "Sebastian," he called out cheerfully, "what are you doing up here sulking like a man at his own funeral? Come down, you'll miss the unmasking." Whitmore hesitated, before giving a slow nod. "All right," he said. "Wait for me." Digby, along with Mrs. Evelyn Montrose, the vivacious widow, waited for him near the entrance to the dance floor, but Whitmore never arrived. Minutes ticked by, the laughter and music swirling around them, yet he was nowhere to be seen. "Honestly," Digby muttered, growing impatient, "does he expect us to wait all night?" Mrs. Montrose tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Perhaps he's back in the supper lounge. He looked rather pale earlier." Together, they made their way to the private dining room, where the Whitmore party had last gathered. As they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the sight before them made Evelyn Montrose let out a piercing scream. There, sprawled across the floor, lay Lord Whitmore. His harlequin mask had fallen to the side, revealing his lifeless face, frozen in a final expression of shock. A silver table knife, buried deep in his chest, glinted under the soft candlelight. A single droplet of blood had splattered onto the white linen tablecloth beside him, like an artist's careless brushstroke on an unfinished masterpiece. The masquerade had ended, and the killer had vanished into the night. The next morning, Newspaper headlines screamed the shocking news across the city. Tragedy at Ravenwood Masquerade. Lord Sebastian Whitmore found murdered. Actress Vivienne Sinclair dead in her bed. The public was in an uproar. The elite whispered in hushed voices over their breakfast tables. Theaters dimmed their lights in mourning. The official report was brief. Vivienne Sinclair, the celebrated actress, had been found lifeless in her opulent Belgravia townhouse, her body cold beneath the silk sheets of her canopied bed. A crystal vial, once filled with cocaine, lay shattered on the floor beside her. The coroner's statement was clear: death by overdose. But was it an accident, or something more sinister? Her maid, a timid girl named Alice Dawes, testified that Miss Sinclair had long been enslaved by the deadly powder, a habit whispered about but rarely confronted in high society. She spoke tearfully of her mistress's declining health, of nights spent in restless delirium, of promises made and broken. The inquest ruled it an unfortunate accident, perhaps even suicide, and yet, certain details did not sit well with the investigators. During the search of Lord Whitmore's belongings, a peculiar item had been discovered: a small enamel box, its lid encrusted with diamonds spelling out a single word: cocoa. Inside, the remnants of white powder gleamed under the gaslight. The maid immediately recognized it as Miss Sinclair's prized possession, the very case she carried with her at all times. The fact that it was found on the dead lord was a troubling revelation. Could he have been taking the drug, as well? Asked Inspector Harrow, his brows furrowed. Highly unlikely, came the response. Lord Whitmore despised narcotics. He was outspoken in his condemnation of the entire trade. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken possibilities. He knew, he had known about Vivienne's addiction. Perhaps he had even confronted her about it on the night of the masquerade. Was that the source of their quarrel? Had he tried to take it from her, to break her dependency? And if so, why had he still been in possession of it at the time of his death? As the detectives pondered, another piece of evidence was produced. From his pocket, Inspector Harrow withdrew a small delicate object, an emerald green silk pompon, its threads frayed, as if it had been violently torn away. "We found this in Lord Whitmore's clenched fist," he said gravely. "Whoever was with him in his final moments, he fought them." The piece of fabric lay on the table between them, a silent witness to a struggle unseen. Poirot studied it with a sharp gaze, then handed it back with a knowing nod. "Tell me," he said, "who had reason to want Lord Whitmore dead?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, a shadow of real doubt passed over Inspector Harrow's face. Lord Whitmore had no known enemies. By all accounts, he was well liked, respected, and without scandal, and yet, two lives had ended within mere hours of each other, one by the knife, the other by poison. Coincidence, or something far darker? The masquerade was over, but the dance of shadows had only just begun. "The Honourable Eustace Blackwood inherits the title and estate," Inspector Harrow announced, his voice calm but weighted with meaning. "And there are whispers," several guests at the masquerade recall, hearing a heated exchange coming from the supper room. Blackwood's voice was unmistakable. Detective Adler leaned forward, fingers drumming against the polished wood of the desk. "The murder weapon, a simple table knife snatched from the supper spread, suggests a crime of passion, not premeditation." Harrow nodded. "Exactly. An argument turned deadly, a moment of uncontrollable rage." He exhaled sharply before adding, "Blackwood, however, dismisses the allegations, claims he was scolding a drunken waiter, and he insists it happened closer to 1 o'clock, not half past." Adler glanced at his notes. "That's a problem. Captain Grayson places Lord Whitmore alive at 1:25, and he was found dead, barely 10 minutes later. Blackwood's timeline doesn't align. And besides," Harrow mused, rubbing his chin, "Blackwood was dressed as Pantalone, complete with a hump and an elaborate ruffled collar. Hardly an outfit for swift, silent murder." Adler frowned. "What does his costume have to do with it?" A slow, knowing smile curled on Harrow's lips. "Everything." He stood pacing the room as if assembling the pieces of a grand puzzle. "Tell me, in that small supper room, was there a curtain?" Adler blinked at the question. "Yes, but a thick, heavy one perhaps. And behind it, a space just large enough for a man to hide." Adler stiffened. "Yes, there's a small alcove behind it. But how the devil do you know that?" You've never even been to Ravenwood Hall. Harrow tapped his temple. I didn't need to. The curtain had to be there without it. The scene lacks reason, and I do not like unreasonable things. Adler stared, his mind racing. You think someone was hidden there, watching, waiting? Harrow's gaze gleamed with that unsettling sharpness Adler had come to recognize. More than that, I believe the killer planned for Whitmore to enter that room. He wasn't merely a victim of circumstance, he was lured. A thick silence settled between them before Adler broke it. Then it wasn't a crime of passion, it was something far worse. Harrow's voice was barely above a whisper. It was a trap. The doctor was summoned immediately, of course, Inspector Harrow continued. But it was futile. Death had been instantaneous. Detective Adler narrowed his eyes, and he testified at the inquest. Harrow nodded. Yes. Did he mention anything unusual, something peculiar about the body, anything that didn't quite fit? The inspector frowned, his fingers tapping against his notepad. Now that you mention it, yes. He noted a stiffness in the limbs, an unnatural tension that he couldn't quite explain. Adler straightened, his gaze sharp. Aha, that's something. Harrow gave him a puzzled look. Something? I don't see how. If you're thinking poison, why would someone go through the trouble of poisoning a man only to drive a knife through his heart immediately afterward? Adler's lips curled into a wry smile, because that would be ridiculous, of course. His voice dripped with irony, but his mind was already racing ahead, connecting unseen threads. Harrow sighed. Look, if you want to examine the crime scene, I can take you to the room where the body was found. Adler waved a dismissive hand. No need, you've already told me the most intriguing part. The inspector arched an eyebrow. And what's that? Lord Whitmore's views on drugs. A heavy silence stretched between them before Harrow spoke again, his voice careful. You think that's relevant? Adler merely smiled, his eyes gleaming. I think it changes everything. Just one thing, Adler said, his voice sharp with intent. Harrow sighed, already bracing himself for another one of Adler's odd yet strangely precise requests. What now? The china figurines. Adler replied, tapping his temple. The ones from which the costumes were copied. Harrow gave him a long skeptical look. You're an odd one, you know that. Adler merely smiled. You can manage that for me. With a reluctant shake of his head, Harrow muttered, Come along then. Berkeley Square. Lord Whitmore, or rather Lord Whitmore II, won't object. They took a cab through the damp London streets, the fog curling along the pavement, like grasping fingers. By the time they arrived, the house loomed before them, a silent monument to wealth and history. Inside, however, the new Lord Whitmore was nowhere to be found, leaving the two men in the care of a butler who led them to the china room, a place where delicate relics of the past rested in pristine silence. Harrow looked around, shifting uncomfortably. I don't see how you'll ever find the ones you want, Adler. There must be 100 figurines in here. But Adler was already moving. His gaze swept the room with the precision of a hawk before he fixated on the mantelpiece. Without hesitation, he pulled a chair over, stepping onto it with surprising agility. Above the mirror, perched on a narrow shelf, stood 6 delicate china figures. Here they are, Adler murmured almost to himself. His fingers traced the edges of each figure, his eyes gleaming with interest. The old Italian comedy. 3 pairs, Harlequin and Columbine, Pierrot and Pierrette, dressed in white and green, and here Punchinello and Pulcinella, in striking mauve and yellow. His fingers hovered over the last pair. Exquisite craftsmanship, he noted. Elaborate detailing, the ruffles, the high hat, the exaggerated hump. He tapped the tiny figure lightly. Yes, as I thought. He replaced them with meticulous care, and stepped down, dusting off his hands, as though concluding an unseen puzzle. Harrow, who had been watching the whole thing with growing irritation, folded his arms. Care to explain what that little performance was about? Adler only smiled, his expression infuriatingly unreadable. Not yet, my friend, but trust me, it changes everything. And with that, he turned on his heel, leaving Harrow to follow, muttering under his breath. Just as we were preparing to leave, the heavy oak door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to being noticed. The master of the house, Lord Whitmore, entered with an air of practiced indifference. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though the very act of existing was an art form he had perfected over the years. Japp, ever the professional, straightened up and made the necessary introductions. Lord Whitmore, this is Mr. Adler. The 6th Viscount Whitmore was a man of about 50, his features still retaining the vestiges of youthful handsomeness, though dulled now by excess. His eyes, hooded and shrewd, studied us as one might examine insects pinned to glass. He was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, whose presence carried the scent of expensive cologne masking something less pleasant underneath. There was an easy charm to him, a velvet smooth manner, but I felt an instant visceral dislike. "I have heard of you, Mr. Adler," he said with a slow, almost languid drawl. "Your reputation precedes you." Adler inclined his head politely. "A pleasure." Lord Whitmore gestured vaguely toward the room around us. "I assume you've come to pick through the remnants of a tragedy. The police, I know, are doing all they can, but alas, I fear the mystery of my nephew's death will remain unsolved." His expression was one of well-rehearsed sorrow, though his eyes betrayed nothing. Adler, however, was watching him with the careful, feline intensity I had come to recognize. "Your nephew," he asked softly, "had no known enemies?" "None whatsoever," Whitmore declared without hesitation. "Of that I am certain." He paused briefly, as if considering something, then added, "If there are any questions you wish to ask, I am entirely at your disposal." "Only one," Adler said, his voice measured, his gaze unwavering. Whitmore arched a brow, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing his face. "And what might that be?" "The costumes," Adler said. "They were recreated exactly from your collection, down to the last detail." Whitmore blinked, as though surprised by the question. Then he nodded. "Yes, to the smallest detail. My nephew was insistent on that point." Adler held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding, as if confirming something to himself. "Thank you, Lord Whitmore. That is all I needed to know." He turned sharply on his heel, and I followed, casting one last glance at the Viscount. He was still standing there, watching us leave, a slow, enigmatic smile curving his lips. As we stepped out into the cold evening air, I turned to Adler. What was that all about? He merely smiled, that maddening knowing smile of his. "You'll see," he murmured. "You'll see soon enough." "And what now?" Japp inquired as we hurried down the dimly lit street, his breath curling in the cool night air. "I've got to report back to the yard, you know." Bien. Adler adjusted his coat, his movements brisk but controlled. "I will not detain you. I have one other little matter to attend to." And then, Japp squinted at him. "Yes?" Adler's lips curved into a knowing smile. "The case will be complete." Japp halted abruptly. "What? You don't mean to say you already know who killed Lord Whitmore?" "Parfaitement." "Then for God's sake, man, out with it. Was it Eustace Beltane?" Adler chuckled softly. "Ah, mon ami, you know my little weakness. I have an insatiable desire to keep the threads in my own hands until the very last moment. But do not worry. I seek no credit. The resolution shall be yours, on one condition." Japp sighed, already accustomed to Adler's flair for dramatics. "And what's that?" "That you allow me to orchestrate the denouement, in my own way." Japp grinned, despite himself. "Fine, but only if this grand denouement actually happens. You're a bloody oyster, you know that." Adler merely smiled, watching as Japp strode off down the street towards Scotland Yard. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Adler raised a hand, signaling a passing taxi. It rolled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to settle over the city. "Where are we off to now?" I asked, my curiosity sharpening. "To Chelsea," Adler replied, sliding into the cab and giving the driver an address. "To visit the Davidsons." As the cab rumbled forward, I turned toward him. "And what do you make of the new Lord Whitmore?" Adler tilted his head slightly. "What does my good friend Carter think?" "I don't trust him," I admitted. "Instinctively, I feel there's something off about him." Adler's eyes twinkled in amusement. "Ah, you suspect him of being the wicked uncle from storybooks, don't you?" He leaned back, folding his arms as he gazed out at the passing streets. "Me? I think he was most amiable toward us." "Because he had his reasons," I muttered. Adler turned to me then, a slow shake of his head, and murmured under his breath, "No method." The words lingered in the air between us as the cab disappeared into the London fog. The Davidsons resided on the third floor of a block of imposing mansion flats, the kind that had once been grand, but now carried the faded elegance of a bygone era. The landlady, a gaunt woman with sunken eyes, led us up a narrow, dimly lit staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath our weight. At the top, a polished brass number plate gleamed on the door, 3B Davidson. Mr. Davidson was out, she informed us in a hushed voice, but Mrs. Davidson was receiving guests. With a slight bow, she ushered us into a long, low-ceilinged room, where heavy oriental tapestries draped the walls, their intricate patterns twisting like silent watchers in the gloom. A haze of incense clung thickly to the air, curling in ghostly tendrils from a bronze burner on a lacquered table. The overpowering scent of joss sticks made the atmosphere almost suffocating. The woman who entered was petite, delicate, a creature of fragile bones and bird-like grace. Her fair hair was pinned in a soft coil at the nape of her neck, and her lips, painted a deep shade of red, curved into a sorrowful smile. At first glance, she exuded an air of quiet grief, the type that made men instinctively protective, but Poirot, ever perceptive, would have noticed what I soon did, the sharp assessing gleam in her pale blue eyes. There was calculation behind the sorrow, an alertness that belied the helpless image she projected. Poirot introduced himself with his customary charm, and she sighed, clasping her small hands together. "Poor Cronk, and poor Coco too," she murmured, shaking her head. "It's been a dreadful time, we were both so fond of her. Her death has been an unbearable grief. But what is it you wish to ask me? Must I really relive that awful night all over again?" Poirot lifted a hand, his voice low and soothing. "Oh, madame, believe me, I would not distress you unnecessarily. Inspector Japp has already provided me with the key facts. I merely wish to see the costume you wore at the ball that night." She blinked, a flicker of hesitation passing over her face. "My costume? Oui, madame," Poirot continued smoothly, his tone as light as if he were discussing the weather. "You see, in my country, we have a method always. We reconstruct the crime. Every small detail is significant. Perhaps I may even hold an actual representation of the events of that evening. In such a case, the accuracy of the costumes is of the utmost importance." A moment of silence stretched between them. She hesitated. The perfumed air felt denser, the shadows of the room pressing in slightly, and then with an elegant little shrug, she smiled. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, if that will help." Her voice was pleasant, accommodating, but as she turned to retrieve the costume, I caught something old in her expression, a flicker so brief it was almost imperceptible. Was it doubt, annoyance, or was it fear? Poirot, standing still as a statue, watched her retreat into the adjoining room, his gaze never leaving her slender form as she disappeared beyond the doorway. And in that moment, I knew he had already seen something the rest of us had missed. Mrs. Davidson hesitated, her fingers briefly tightening around the folds of her dress. "I've heard of reconstructing a crime, of course," she said slowly, her voice carefully measured, "but I didn't realize you were so particular about the smallest details." Poirot inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "It is in the details, madame, that the truth so often reveals itself." She studied him for a moment, then with a delicate shrug, turned and disappeared through a side door. The oppressive scent of incense clung to the silence she left behind. I glanced at Poirot, but his gaze was fixed on the tapestry-covered walls, his fingers lightly drumming against his walking cane. Moments later she returned, carrying a wisp of a gown, white satin with green accents, the very picture of elegance. The fabric shimmered under the dim lighting, as she held it up for us to see. Poirot stepped forward and took the dress from her, his movements careful, deliberate. He ran his fingers over the material, his touch feather-light, but methodical, his gaze razor-sharp. A fleeting expression passed over Mrs. Davidson's face, impatience perhaps, or something more guarded. Poirot returned the dress with a slight bow. "Merci, madame, a most charming costume, though I see you have had the misfortune to lose one of your green pompons, the one on the shoulder here." Her reaction was subtle, but I did not miss the way her throat bobbed slightly before she spoke. "Yes, it got torn off at the ball," she said with a practiced air. "I picked it up and gave it to poor Lord Cronshaw to keep for me." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, how unfortunate. That was after supper, I assume." "Yes," she said quickly. "Not long before the tragedy, perhaps." There, a flicker in her pale blue eyes, something barely perceptible but present nonetheless. A faint momentary alarm. "Oh no," she said, her voice a touch too brisk. "Long before that. Quite soon after supper, in fact." "I see," Poirot murmured. He regarded her with an expression of polite satisfaction. "Well, that is all. I shall not trouble you further. Bonjour." As we stepped out into the cool evening air, I exhaled, shaking my head. "Well, that explains the mystery of the green pompon." Poirot's lips twitched. "I wonder," I frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced at me, the lamplight catching the sharp gleam in his eyes. "You saw me examine the dress, Hastings." "Yes?" "Eh bien." The pompon that was missing had not been wrenched off, as the lady claimed. "No, mon ami. It was removed with great precision." He lifted a finger. It had been cut off with scissors. The threads were too even, too clean for anything else. I stopped short. "Dear me," I exclaimed. "This becomes more and more involved." Poirot chuckled softly, his eyes glittering with the satisfaction of a man seeing the puzzle take shape. "On the contrary, my dear Hastings," he said placidly, "it becomes more and more simple." "Poirot," I cried in exasperation, "one day I shall murder you. Your habit of finding everything perfectly simple is maddening beyond words." Poirot merely chuckled, adjusting his cuffs with an air of supreme satisfaction. "But mon ami, when I explain, is it not always perfectly simple?" "Yes, and that is precisely what infuriates me," I exclaimed, "because then I feel as though I could have solved it myself." Poirot patted my shoulder with an amused glint in his eyes. "And so you could, Hastings. So you could, if only you took the trouble to arrange your ideas, without method." "Yes, yes," I cut in hastily, knowing all too well that any mention of method would launch him into an endless monologue. "Tell me, what do we do next? Are you really planning to reconstruct the crime?" "Hardly that," Poirot said, his voice carrying a mischievous lilt. "Shall we say the drama is over, but I propose to add a harlequinade." "A harlequinade." The words sent a shiver of intrigue down my spine. Poirot's methods were often unorthodox, but this sounded like something entirely new. The following Tuesday was set for this mysterious performance, and the preparations filled me with intense curiosity. Poirot supervised every detail with the precision of a theatre director, his little figure darting about as he orchestrated the scene. A large white screen was erected on one side of the room, flanked by heavy velvet curtains, their dark folds swallowing the light. A technician arrived next, adjusting a series of powerful stage lights that cast eerie shadows against the walls. And finally, a group of theatrical performers appeared, slipping away into Poirot's bedroom, now transformed into a temporary dressing room. As the hour neared, I felt a creeping tension settle over the household. What was Poirot planning? What revelation was he about to stage? Shortly before 8, Japp arrived, looking rather out of sorts. He set his hat down with a sigh, and folded his arms across his chest. "Well, I suppose I might as well see this through," he muttered, shaking his head. "A bit melodramatic, like all of his ideas, but there, what harm can it do? And as he says, it might save us all a good bit of trouble." He shot me a sideways glance and added, with a little too much confidence, "Of course I was on the same scent myself." I stifled a smile. Japp was lying, and he knew it. Poirot had been 3 steps ahead of him all along, and we both knew it. Just then the door swung open, and the guests began to arrive. First through the door was Lord Willoughby, his expression stiff, escorting a woman I had not yet seen, Mrs. Mollerby. She was a striking figure, with dark, wavy hair and large, expressive eyes that darted anxiously around the room. Despite her poised exterior, there was something unmistakably nervous about her. Next came the Davidsons. Mrs. Davidson's frail frame was wrapped in an elaborate shawl, her keen blue eyes scanning the scene with barely concealed apprehension. A hush settled over the room as Poirot stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. The stage was set, The audience was assembled, and the final act of Poirot's harlequinade was about to begin. Chris Davidson entered the room with the confident ease of a man accustomed to admiration. Tall, dark, and undeniably handsome, he had the polished elegance of an actor accustomed to the spotlight. His eyes flickered across the gathered company, lingering just a moment too long on Mrs. Mollerby. There was something unnerving in his effortless charm, something calculated beneath the surface. Poirot, ever the master of theatrics, had arranged the room with meticulous precision. Rows of chairs faced a large white screen, bathed in an eerie glow from a bright lamp positioned behind it. Every other light in the room had been extinguished, plunging the space into darkness except for the pale, almost ghostly illumination of the screen. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. I could sense it in the stiff postures, the quick glances exchanged, the occasional nervous cough breaking the silence. Then from the darkness, Poirot's voice rose, rich and measured, yet carrying a note of quiet intensity. "Messieurs, mesdames," a word of explanation. A hush fell over the room, even the air seemed to still. "6 figures will appear before you, they are familiar to you all." Poirot's voice was calm, deliberate. Poirot and his Pierrette, innocence entwined in moonlight. Punchinello, the buffoon, laughing at fate. Pulcinella, elegant, cunning, and cruel. The beautiful Columbine, light as air, untouchable in her dance. And finally, Poirot paused ever so slightly, and I could almost hear the breath catching in someone's throat. Harlequin, the silent trickster, the unseen sprite, the one who watches, yet remains invisible. A shiver ran down my spine. I did not know why, but there was something deeply unsettling in those words. Then the show began. One by one, the figures appeared against the screen, their shadows looming larger than life. Poirot, stepping forward hesitantly, his Pierrette beside him, reaching out but never quite touching. Punchinello, his grotesque form frozen in mock laughter. Pulcinella, bowing with theatrical grace, his elegance edged with menace. Columbine, her silhouette twirling like a whisper of lace and air. And then, a final shape. Harlequin. The room grew colder. The shadow that flickered on the screen was different. It did not move as the others had. It stood still, watching. For a moment I thought I heard something, a sharp involuntary intake of breath from somewhere in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The lights came up, their brilliance almost blinding after the murky half-darkness. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats, glancing uneasily at one another. I, too, felt a strange unease. The tension had been unbearable, but for what? Poirot's performance had been striking, yes, but what had it achieved? If he had hoped to startle the murderer into revealing themselves, the effort had failed. The room remained silent, the audience shaken, yet composed. Poirot, however, was beaming. He stepped forward, clasping his hands together, looking immensely pleased with himself. "Now, messieurs and mesdames, if you would be so good, one at a time, tell me." He paused, his dark eyes scanning the faces before him. "What is it that you have just seen? Let us begin, my lord." His voice was light, almost casual, but I knew Poirot too well. Beneath the politeness, beneath the charm, there was something else, something deadly, something that told me, without a shadow of a doubt, that this harlequinade had been no mere performance. It had been a trap, and someone in this room had just walked into it. The room remained eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the electric lamp still casting its glow upon the screen. The gentleman shifted uneasily in his chair, his brow furrowing. "I'm afraid I don't quite understand," he said hesitantly, glancing around as if seeking reassurance from the others. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered. "Simply tell me, my lord, what you have just seen." Well," came the uncertain reply. "I should say we have seen 6 figures passing in front of the screen, dressed to represent the personages in the old Italian comedy, or perhaps ourselves." The other night, Poirot lifted a hand, cutting off further speculation. "Never mind the other night, my lord," he said smoothly. "The first part of your statement is what I wanted." His gaze swept to Mrs. Mellerby. "Madam, do you agree with my Lord Cronshaw?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. "I suppose so, yes." Poirot turned to Mr. Davidson. "And you, monsieur?" Davidson nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Madam Davidson, Yes, Hastings, Jap, we both murmured our assent, though something about Poirot's demeanor unsettled me. His face, usually so composed, had taken on a strange pallor. His eyes, dark, luminous, almost feline, glowed with an intensity that sent a shiver through me. He let the silence stretch for a moment longer, letting the tension coil tighter around us. "And yet," he said at last, his voice low, charged with quiet authority, "you are all wrong." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. Poirot lifted a hand, his voice rising slightly. "Your eyes have deceived you, as they deceived you on the night of the Victory Ball. To see with your eyes is not always to see the truth. One must see with the mind. One must employ the little grey cells." His fingers tapped his temple. "Know then that tonight and on that night you saw not 6 figures but 5. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the room. A chair creaked. See, the lights went out again, plunging us into sudden darkness. A hush fell thick and expectant. Then a figure bounded into the light, its silhouette stark against the glowing screen. "Who is that?" Poirot's voice demanded from the shadows. Poirot's came the chorus of replies. A beat, then look again. With a swift, almost violent motion, the figure tore away the loose folds of its white Pierrot's garb. The room seemed to freeze. There, standing motionless in the limelight, was not Pierrot, it was Harlequin, glittering, sharp, undeniable. A gasp cut through the silence. A chair toppled backward. Then a snarl of rage, raw, unrestrained. "Curse you!" Davidson's voice, twisted with fury, rang through the room. "Curse you! How did you guess?" A scrape of movement, but Poirot was faster. The sharp clink of handcuffs shattered the stunned silence. Chap's voice, cool and matter-of-fact, followed immediately. "Christopher Davidson, I arrest you on the charge of murdering Viscount Cronshaw. Anything you say will be used in evidence against you." Davidson let out a ragged breath, his struggle ceasing as the weight of his capture settled upon him. The room remained deadly silent, save for the distant ticking of a clock. The game was over, but the ghost of Harlequin still lingered in the shadows. It was a quarter of an hour later. The tension in the air had dissipated, replaced by the quiet clinking of fine china and the subtle rustle of napkins. A recherché little supper had appeared, its rich aromas curling through the air like the final act of a well-played drama. Poirot, beaming like a satisfied conjurer who had just performed his greatest trick, was dispensing hospitality with all the elegance of a seasoned maître d'hôtes. He filled glasses with delicate precision, offered plates with a knowing twinkle in his eye, all the while fielding our eager questions with the air of a man who had long anticipated them. "Mon Dieu, but it was all so simple," he declared, placing a delicate tart onto his plate before gesturing expansively. "The green pompon, ah, that was the key. The circumstances in which it was found suggested immediately that it had been torn from the costume of the murderer." He tapped his temple. "But let us reason. Who among them could have wielded the knife?" I leaned forward, engrossed. "I dismissed Pierrette at once." Poirot continued, shaking his head. Non, such a delicate lady. It takes considerable force to drive a table knife into a man's heart. That left Pierrot." I exchanged a glance with Jap. "But Pierrot," I began. "Ah, just so. Pierrot left the ball nearly 2 hours before the murder. So, my friends, what does that tell us?" He leaned in, eyes glinting. Either he returned later to commit the crime, or he killed before he ever left. A shiver ran down my spine. But Chap interjected, setting his glass down. "Lord Cronshaw was seen after supper, was he not?" Poirot's expression turned grave. "Was he?" He let the question hang for a moment. He picked up his fork and twirled it idly between his fingers. "Tell me, who was the only person who claimed to have seen him after supper?" I frowned, my mind racing. Then it struck me. Mrs. Davidson, précisément. Poirot snapped his fingers. And what did she say? That she had given him the missing pompon to keep for her. But that was a lie, a carefully crafted falsehood, designed to account for the missing decoration, because in reality, She had cut it from her own dress to replace the one torn from her husband's costume. Chap let out a low whistle. I felt a sudden, creeping unease. But then, if Lord Cronshaw was already dead, then the Harlequin seen later in the box must have been an impostor. Poirot's eyes gleamed triumphantly. And who better suited for such a deception than a seasoned actor, a man trained in the art of mimicry, someone of a similar height to the victim? He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Christopher Davidson. A hush fell over the table. Poirot took a sip of his wine, savoring it before continuing. For a moment, I entertained the idea that perhaps Mr. Beltane was the guilty party, but no, it was impossible. His elaborate costume made it utterly impractical for him to quickly change roles. But Davidson, for him a simple transformation, an illusion executed with the precision of the stage. I exhaled slowly, my mind racing, but I hesitated. There was one thing I couldn't understand. The doctor, surely he could tell that Lord Cronshaw had been dead for nearly 2 hours. The difference between a fresh corpse and one long deceased must have been obvious. Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile. Ah, mon ami, you see, but you do not observe. He tapped his temple again. Yes, the doctor could have told the difference. And indeed, he did notice something amiss. But let me ask you, was he ever asked how long the victim had been dead? I stared at him. Non, mon cher Hastings, he was not. Instead he was merely told, this man was seen alive only 10 minutes ago. Poirot's expression turned shrewd. So what did the doctor do? He merely observed, quite truthfully, that the victim's limbs were already abnormally stiff, something for which he was quite unable to account. A slow realization dawned on me. The deception was so complete, Poirot finished, leaning back with satisfaction, that even the truth became a lie. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Japp let out a deep sigh, shaking his head with begrudging admiration. The devil take you, Poirot, he muttered. You do make a man feel slow. Poirot beamed, lifting his glass. To justice, my friends. I raised mine, my mind still turning over every brilliant twist of the case. Outside, the city hummed on, oblivious to the secrets unraveled within these 4 walls. And in the flickering candlelight, Poirot's little grey cells had once again unmasked a killer. Everything now aligned perfectly with my theory. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, revealing a dark and intricate design beneath the glittering mask of the evening's festivities. Davidson had killed Lord Cronshaw immediately after supper. That much was now beyond doubt. He had been seen drawing Cronshaw back into the supper room, his manner forceful, insistent. A conversation had taken place, no doubt an argument, one in which Cronshaw had confronted him. And then in that fateful moment, when words failed and consequences loomed, Davidson had struck with deadly precision, silencing the one man who stood between him and his secret. But the brilliance of his deception lay in what came next. He left the ball, with Miss Courtenay on his arm. He played the part of the agitated lover, carefully laying the groundwork for his alibi. He accompanied her to the door of her flat, but did not enter. He had no time for placation or persuasion. He had something far more pressing to attend to. Instead he returned to the Colossus, not as Pierrot, but as Harlequin. The transformation was chillingly simple, a mere slipping off of his outer costume, revealing beneath it the elegant diamond-patched attire of Harlequin. In an instant, he became another man, a different guest, a different presence entirely. It was a performance worthy of the stage, a masterstroke of illusion. From across the room, the uncle of the murdered man leaned forward, his brows furrowed in deep perplexity. But if that is so, he mused, Davidson must have come to the ball already intending to kill. What could have driven him to such an act? What? He hesitated. What was his motive? Poirot's expression darkened, his voice taking on the gravity of a man revealing the final tragic twist of fate. Ah, he murmured, there we come to the second tragedy, that of Miss Courtenay. A hush settled over the room, the weight of his words pressing down upon us like an unseen force. There was one simple fact that everyone overlooked. Poirot continued, Miss Courtenay died of cocaine poisoning. That we knew, but where, mon nan, was her supply of the drug? His gaze swept across the room. In the enamel box found on Lord Cronshaw's body, a slow chilling realization crept over me. Then, how did she obtain the dose that killed her? I whispered. Poirot nodded, his voice like a knife in the dark. There was only one person who could have given it to her. Davidson. Japp let out a sharp breath. And that Messamise explains everything. Poirot pressed on, his voice low, deliberate. It explains why she was so insistent that Davidson be the one to escort her home. It explains the depth of their connection, beyond the pretense of mere friendship. He paused. She was dependent on him. He was her supplier. A shudder ran through me. Lord Cronshaw, Poirot continued, was fanatically opposed to drugs. When he discovered that the woman he cared for was an addict, his disgust must have been profound. But worse, he knew that Davidson was behind it. Oh yes, Davidson may have denied it, may have pleaded innocence, but Cronshaw was determined. He would extract the truth from Miss Courtenay that night, at the ball. Poirot's voice dropped lower. He may have forgiven the girl, but the man who profited from her addiction, never. A tense silence filled the room. Davidson was cornered, his secret dangerously close to being exposed. The life he had built, his respectability, his wealth, his carefully crafted reputation, would all come crashing down in ruin and disgrace. He had one choice. Cronshaw had to be silenced, and so he came to the ball prepared to kill. A sharp intake of breath from the victim's uncle broke the silence. His hands trembled as he turned his gaze toward Poirot. And Coco's death, he asked hesitantly. Was that an accident? Poirot's expression was unreadable. Perhaps he admitted, or perhaps it was an accident, cleverly arranged. Think, Messamise. She was furious with Cronshaw that night, angry at his reproaches, enraged that he had taken her cocaine from her. Poirot spread his hands, and then along came Davidson, the comforter, the provider. He gave her more, perhaps even suggested she take an extra dose in defiance of old Cronshaw. Poirot's voice grew softer, a whisper here, a temptation there, and a woman already fragile, already lost, made her final fatal mistake. I swallowed hard. Poirot leaned back, his eyes glittering. And so, you see, he murmured, 2 lives ended that night, one by murder, the other by something far more insidious. A heavy silence hung in the air. Japp cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. One last thing, Poirot, he said gruffly. That recess and curtain, how did you know about them? Poirot beamed. Ah, monsieur, that was the simplest deduction of all. He tapped the table lightly. Waiters had been in and out of that little room all evening, so clearly the body could not have been lying where it was found, right in the open, on the floor. That meant there had to be a place to hide it. He spread his hands. A simple matter of logic. If one must conceal a body in a small room, one looks for a curtain, a recess, a hidden alcove. Japp let out a low whistle. Davidson, Poirot concluded, dragged the body behind the curtain, and later, after ensuring he was seen in the box as Harlequin, he dragged it out again, ensuring it was discovered before he slipped away into the night. Poirot's smile was warm, almost amused, but his eyes, the feline, knowing green of them, held a different message entirely. Yes, Davidson was clever, but not quite so clever as Hercule Poirot.